Good afternoon. Thank you all again for joining us. As we begin, I'd like to turn to Dean Karen for an official welcome.
Thank you all for joining us here today. Following up on our fantastic Dean Speaker series in the fall with our speakers, Dorothy Brown, Robbie George, and Will Morris, we're going to continue in 2021 to discuss the themes of race, social justice, and faith by bringing important and diverse speakers to our law school. We are pleased to open our 2021 Dean Speaker Series with today's event in the honor of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and sponsored by our New Bar Institute for Law, Religion, and Ethics. Last Monday, January 18th, we observed Martin Luther King Jr. Day at a time when our country faces racial and social justice issues, just as we did during Dr. King's life. Dr. King famously said, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." He also said, "Life's most persistent and urgent question is, what are you doing for others?" At Pepperdine Crusoe Law, we are committed to helping each and every member of our family become agents of justice and bringing love and light to a world in service to others. In that spirit, I'm excited to host today's event on the intersection of faith, social justice, and racial reconciliation. Please join me in welcoming Dean Shaw-Richards, who will be introducing our speakers and moderating the conversation today.
Thank you so much, Dean Karen. And it is a pleasure to be here today. As Dean Karen mentioned, my name is Shaw-Richards. I'm Assistant Dean for Student Life, Diversity, and Belonging here at Pepperdine Crusoe School of Law. I want to take a moment before I introduce our speakers to thank Dean Karen for including this in the Dean Speaker Series and the Newt Bar Institute for sponsoring today's interfaith discussion. It is essential to who we are as a law school, and I'm always so pleased to see how we come together as a community to uplift and hold these crucial conversations. Today, we will be discussing the intersection of faith, social justice, and racial reconciliation. And I couldn't be more thrilled and excited about our guest speakers and panelists today. If you are on social media, if you watch Good Morning America or CNN, if you've been out in the world reading some great Jewish or Christian literature at any time, then these two will be thrilling for you and I believe really spark conversation. First, we have Rabbi Sharon Brous, who is the senior and founding rabbi of ICAR, which launched in 2004 with the goal of reinvigorating Jewish tradition and practice and inspiring people of faith to reclaim a moral and prophetic voice. ICAR, one of the fastest growing and most influential Jewish congregations in the country, is credited with sparking a rethinking of religious life in a time of unprecedented disaffection and declining affiliation. And in fact, several members of our own community are members of that congregation and add so much to us. Rabbi Brous's TED Talk, Reclaiming Religion, has been viewed by more than 1 million people and translated into 14 languages. In 2013, she blessed President Obama and then Vice President Biden at the inaugural National Prayer Breakfast Service. And in 2017, she spoke at the Women's March in Washington, D.C. She has been named #1 on the Newsweek Daily Beast list of the most influential rabbis in America and has been recognized numerous times by the Forward and Jerusalem Post as one of the 50 most influential Jews. Reverend Eugene Cho also joins us today. His many passions involve leadership, justice, the whole gospel, and the pursuit of God's kingdom here on earth. He travels throughout the world to encourage churches, nonprofits, pastors, leaders, missionaries, and justice workers, whether this happens in churches, arenas, conferences, universities, or as a guest in underground churches or refugee camps. Reverend Cho is the president and CEO of Bread for the World and Bread Institute, a prominent nonpartisan Christian advocacy organization urging both national and global decision makers to help end hunger, both in the United States and around the world. He is also the founder and visionary of One Day's Wages, a grassroots movement of people, stories, and actions to alleviate extreme global poverty. After 18 years, Reverend Cho stepped aside as founder and senior pastor of Quest Church in Seattle, Washington, and is the author of 2 acclaimed books, Thou Shalt Not Be a Jerk, A Christian's Guide to Engaging Politics, certainly timely for the moment in which we found ourselves, and Overrated, Are We More in Love with the Idea of Changing the World Than Actually Changing the World? Please join me in a virtual round of applause for both of our guests today. I hope that you will engage with us through this conversation. We have questions planned and really have planned for it to be a conversation, but please use the chat box, please use the Q&A feature, and don't just wait for the Q&A time to really help us to continue this dialogue. So I have the first question for both of you, and again, in honor of Dr. Martin Luther King Day, and all that he was motivated to do, we've seen was by what he saw as the mandates of his faith in the fight for civil rights. Can you speak, Reverend Cho, Rabbi Brous, to how you see faith as intersecting with social justice and civil rights? And perhaps, Rabbi, I will begin with you.
Yeah, thank you so much. First of all, I'm thrilled to be here with you. And thank you, Dean Richards. And thank you, Dean Karen, for pulling this together. And as I read Pastor Cho's bio, I was thinking we should be friends. So it's good that we're meeting this way. There's so much that I'm eager to talk to all of you about today. So thank you for convening this this conversation. And it's really an honor to be here. The intersection of faith and justice. Well, I can just start by saying that for me, as a Jewish American woman, my heart was really awakened, and my sense of faith was really awakened by the teachings of a Baptist minister who introduced me to a God and a theology that he actually drew from the core narrative of my people, from the story of the Israelites and their enslavement in Egypt, and ultimately the long walk toward freedom. Dr. King's sermons and many speeches and teachings really became the foundation of my own theology and helped me understand how my commitment to justice was actually an expression, a core expression of my faith. So one of his sermons in particular that I often reread and return to is one that he delivered in 1955 at Dexter Avenue Baptist, which was called The Death of Evil Upon the Seashore. And he was 25 years old when he gave this sermon. This was a sermon that essentially includes his commentary on the liberation story of the Israelite people from Egypt, in which he sees the political struggle between the Israelites and the Egyptians as a kind of paradigm for the struggle for justice throughout history. And so he very clearly was able to see the struggle for justice for Black Americans in that paradigm of the eternal battle between good and evil, between humiliation, oppression, exploitation, domination, and devotion, dedication to God, service to God, compassion, equity and equality, justice, and human dignity. And for me, the recognition of that core story as foundational to Dr. King's faith gave me permission to look at my own story as a kind of core meta narrative in which we understand that as people of faith, our work is to build a just and loving society. And Dr. King very famously says in that sermon that what we learn about evil from the narrative of Pharaoh and the Egyptian enslavement is that evil never voluntarily relinquishes its throne, that evil is stubborn and hard and determined, and it never gives up without a struggle and without the most persistent, almost fanatical resistance. And I've come back to that again and again, especially over the course of the past several years, as I've tried to understand what does it really mean to be a person of faith in a society that is just drenched in inequities and in oppression? What does it mean to stand up and really engage in acts of faithful resistance against unjust systems and structures and policies that continue to perpetuate unjust systems? And so I believe that faith, the path to faith and justice is completely one now. This is one journey, one path, and it is the deepest expression of my faith when I engage in the work of trying to build a more equitable and a more just society. And I'll just close by saying, for me, and I hope we can talk about this today, but it's very painful for me as a person of faith. Like personally, I feel it in my body when I see violent religious extremism, when I see what I consider to be a heretical manipulation of religion that's used to promote a violent, misogynistic, white supremacist agenda in this country and around the world. Because for me, faith is exactly the opposite of that. It's the force that draws us to try to manifest God's dignity, God's presence in every single human being by lifting up, by breaking down those inequitable structures and actually lifting up the human being as the greatest manifestation of the presence of God in the world.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Brous, just for even that introduction and that thought about how our faith, I loved what you said, that our faith and justice is one journey and one path, where sometimes we'll separate them and think, today I do my faith, tomorrow I do justice work, but seeing them as merged together. I'm so looking forward to diving a little bit more into some of that. Reverend Cho, can you share how you see faith, generally in your faith, as intersecting with social justice and civil rights?
Thank you again for the invitation to be here, Rabbi Sharon. Thank you for those kind words. We're now best friends. Look forward to connecting with you in the future. I almost want to just say ditto, honestly. I rarely do this, but I almost just want to say ditto to everything that Rabbi Sharon shared. Maybe I'll just add a little bit more context from my vantage point as a Christ follower, as a Christian. I'm ordained through a denomination called the Evangelical Covenant Church. That word evangelical is a very confusing word in our world today. In my city, where I call home, Seattle, when people ask me what I do, it's sometimes challenging. Not that I'm timid about my calling as a pastor, but anytime I mention the word that I'm a pastor, people tend to cringe in our context today. And when I do answer the question and they ask me what denomination I'm a part of, and I mentioned the word evangelical, that pretty much ends the conversation at that moment. In some ways, I have a feeling that we'll talk more about this, but we've seen both symbols and phrases and entire religions being hijacked during the craziness of this past month and really in the last decade or so. But I'd like to maybe share my perspective and somewhat align it to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. In 2016 or 2017, if this sounds like a humble brag, I apologize for it. It's still one of the deepest honors and privileges that I've had. In 2016, I had the privilege of being invited by the King family to speak at Ebenezer Baptist Church for the MLK celebration. It was the best 5-hour service that I was ever a part of. It went by so quickly. And during this time, I learned what most folks might not know. In today's world, nearly everyone tends to have a deep love and affection for Dr. King. He's universally loved. And even though we may have heard phrases that he was disliked, that word just does not do justice. He was hated and vilified. The last time I think there was a poll in his last year of his life, I think it was about 61% of Americans saw him as the most hated American on this country. And yet, it's also really important for me to highlight that his faith was a central aspect to his being, his essence. And the reason why I share this is I was doing a talk with younger folks, college students, high school students, and I was alarmed at the number of students, young people, and I'm not trying to bash on them, but I was surprised that so few of them knew that he was actually a Baptist preacher, a Baptist pastor, because so much of his identity has now been rooted in his activism, and again, rightfully so, in his oratorial skills, in his theological brilliance. All of those things matter. But people forget in today's perspective that the essence of this man, the essence of this servant was his faith. And so as a fellow Christian, remind people there, or was the why he chose to live the life he was called to. It was because of his faith. In today's language, we tend to use words like intersection, interlocking, and such, and there's room and space for it. For me, faith wasn't an intersection for him. It was the very core of who he was. And so pursuing things like racial reconciliation, justice, it wasn't an option. It was not something that he chose to do. It was simply an embodiment of who he was. So for me, as a follower of Christ, as a person of faith, social justice may not be the totality of the gospel as I see it, but the gospel without a commitment to neighbor, the vulnerable, justice, the common good is simply not a faithful gospel. And so when I think about Dr. King, I'm appreciative that despite the fact that, like every single person here on this call, was a imperfect, I'm so grateful for his courage and for his moral courage to be obedient to his faith.
Thank you, Reverend Cho. And that reminder as well, I think coupled together, right? So ditto to Rabbi Brous, well, also that reminder, as you said, that the gospel without a commitment to your neighbor, to the vulnerable, is not a faithful gospel. That is going to resonate inside me. And I think it provides a challenge and a charge to us on how we walk out and live this. And especially we have law students and practicing attorneys with us today on how we practice the law, how we live out the law, if we're doing it from a place of commitment to the vulnerable and to those around us. Oh my gosh, I'm already so full, as we would say in my church tradition. I'm full right now. But I want to move and stay a little bit on the civil rights movement and Reverend King, Dr. King. So historically, this was an interfaith movement. And I think sometimes people forget that, right? Famously, there were Jewish civil rights workers who were murdered in 1964 while registering voters in Mississippi. And I'm wondering, we see that historically, if either of you can speak to what a modern interfaith civil rights or social justice movement can look like and how we can move that forward. Rabbi Brous, it looks like you may have a comment on this.
Yeah, I'm happy to try to address this. I mean, it seems very clear to me that any successful movement for social change right now, especially one that will be the kind of reckoning that we so desperately need in our country, has to be multi-faith. It has to be one that is a fusion movement. I'm sure you're familiar with the work of Bishop Barber, William Barber, who really sees himself as a kind of student of Dr. King, and his prophetic mandate is to pick up the baton and carry on, and restarted the Poor People's Campaign, which was one of the efforts at Dr. King's that was cut short. And the idea very deliberately was from the start that this has to be a fusion movement. This isn't about Black versus white. It's not about Christian versus Muslim versus Jews. This is about all of us, because we belong to each other, because our liberation really is tied up in one another. And right now we're in the part, we sync up our readings from the Hebrew Bible all across the Jewish world. So every year, right after High Holy Days, we start a new cycle. And we start from the beginning of the book of Genesis. And so it always happens that right around inauguration, we're right at the beginning of the Exodus narrative. And so that's where we are these past couple of weeks. And this week, we actually are going to read the crossing of the Red Sea all over the world, wherever Jews are. And that's part of the reason that I'm so attuned to what this liberation, what the paradigm of real liberation looks like. And what I'm seeing this year in these stories that strikes me as so profoundly tragic is that Pharaoh was given the opportunity again and again and again to be a part of the liberation of the Israelite people. It didn't have to be that those chariots would drown in the sea and the Israelites would go on to build a different society. They could have built a society together, but he was so stuck in his mindset of supremacy that he couldn't understand what it would mean to live in a society that actually lifted everyone up. And what's so clear right now, especially in light of this really profound, what I consider a great awakening, what's happening in the United States over the last several years, but especially since the murder of Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor and George Floyd, there's a great awakening that's happening right now where a lot of people who've been really asleep at the wheel for many, many years because they were on the other side of the privilege equation now recognize that they're also a part of this. And that liberation for some requires liberation for all. And so this movement seems very clear to me that this has to be a multi-faith movement, and not only of people of faith, but also people who are not people of faith, people who don't identify with any faith tradition, but who want to see themselves on the side of history that supports the building of a just and loving society. And I know that that's absolutely possible here. There's incredible resistance to it because there's always resistance to people who hold the power and privilege, sharing their power and privilege. And yet that's the only way that we can all ultimately walk toward redemption and liberation.
You're preaching, Rabbi Brous, as we would say. I mean, just that I had not considered that Exodus story, and of course, Reverend Cho may have, in that way, that Pharaoh was invited into liberation and made the choice not to be involved.
Yes.
And what that means for us. Oh my goodness. Thank you. Reverend Cho, do you have anything to add or even to feed off of that conversation?
Well, as someone that has spent some time being formed and influenced in the Black church, I was tempted to take off my shoe and just throw it at Rabbi Sharon, but probably wouldn't work in a virtual setting.
I was holding back my amens.
Right. No, it's beautiful and it's compelling. Just a couple thoughts to maybe add to this. In the New Testament, we see Jesus having ongoing, consistent, regular conversations with these Pharisees and these religious leaders. And part of the reason why he keeps pursuing them is that he loves them. God's love is not just for the oppressed, it's also for the oppressors as well. And so as Rabbi Sharon mentioned, the desire for Pharaoh's heart to change. I think it's important for us to articulate that both of these things can be held in tension, that as we speak up and advocate and fight for those who are vulnerable in our society, that God has hearts and God has a desire for the oppressor to also repent and to change their ways so that we can be part of a more just, compassionate, merciful society as well. To your question more specifically about what an interfaith civil rights movement looks like, the very fundamental question, it's of all religion, question, who is my neighbor? That question, that's what should compel us. Yes, all of us come from a faith background, but if we're also honest, we can also acknowledge that there are not just nuances, but there are differences in our faith backgrounds. We don't have to muddle those waters, but even as we hold to our distinctive beliefs, there are some commonalities in every single one of our religious backgrounds. And one of them is to love our neighbors, to be kind to our neighbors, to be merciful to our neighbors. And so from a Christian perspective, I'm trying to encourage the wider capital C church to have a broader imagination and commitment to interfaith work, to ecumenical work, because when Jesus says to love your neighbors, he's not saying to love your neighbors that look like you, think like you, feel like you, worship like you. And I know this might be sensitive, but I think it needs to be said, even those that might not vote like you. I'm not suggesting that we should be soft in our convictions, but we have to remind ourselves that during this time, this challenge of loving our neighbors may be one of the biggest tasks for us to do. But when we see the well-being, the vulnerability, the challenges of our neighbors at stake, then we don't have to hold into the me, myself, my tribe, my religion, my faith. We can work together for that more just, compassionate, and merciful society. The last thing that I'll just say is that it's really easy to talk about these things and not necessarily have genuine friendships and relationships of people of different religious backgrounds, racial backgrounds, and the list goes on. And it's something that deeply concerns me, that our ideology has trumped, our ideology has superseded everything else to the point that we're no longer willing or able or even capable of having genuine friendships and relationships with. I don't want to make it sound so mushy, but I do believe that as we're talking about societal and structural change, we can't abandon the importance of that personal, interpersonal relationships and friendships that are critical to our human dignity and essence.
Thank you. And thank you for that reminder of the charge to love our neighbors, right? I'm reminded of what Jesus said were the two greatest commandments based off of the Old Testament, to love God and to love your neighbor as you love yourself. I want to, Rabbi Brous, build off of something you said, and even one of your members, I'm going to give her a shout out because I know she's attending, Michelle Feinstein, shared an email that you wrote with the community following, I believe it was following the January 6th attacks, where you shared with your congregation, your membership, that we are entering a new age of accountability, justice, and honesty that requires a spiritual transformation. And that phrase, spiritual transformation, really grabbed me. I'm wondering if you can elaborate for us on a broader context what you mean by this age of accountability, justice, and honesty as a spiritual transformation, and how we can do that as a community that involves, as both of you have pointed out, people from all walks of life, all socioeconomic backgrounds, racial backgrounds, religious backgrounds, how we can undergo that transformation together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for that. Thank you for that question. And I'm grateful to Michelle for sharing that with you. I'll tell you that when the pandemic first began to affect our lives here in America, in the early spring, I really felt this fierce sense that we had to learn a lesson from this, that we had to take this opportunity to be transformed as a nation and as a global community too. And so, in other words, it couldn't be that maybe we're home for 2 weeks and then we're back and everything's, that during a time of unveiling, when we learn truths, we have to learn how to allow those truths to change us, not just to get us to revert back. And I ended up going really deep into my own Jewish history and to our Jewish tradition to try to understand what is the paradigm for what happens when we actually lay a world to rest, when we and then build a new world. What do we do when it's time to let something die and then allow something new to be born? And the paradigm that I came to was the moment of the end of Jerusalem, actually the end of the Second Temple, when the Romans besieged the city of Jerusalem, and the people were starving and dying inside, and they knew that the end was there. And there was one rabbi named Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, and he convinced his students to put him into a coffin and then carry him out of the gates of the city as if to burial. And then he emerged from the coffin on the other side, and they built a new Judaism on the other side. And all of the people who are now identify as Jewish or practitioners of Judaism are all descendants of that Judaism. The Jerusalem and the Judaism of Jerusalem was destroyed. They burned, they murdered, they raped, they plundered, and they enslaved everyone who was left. But the Judaism that are my ancestry comes from what survived. The people who played dead to leave and then built something new. And what I found, I'll say this very, very quickly, but what I found was that there are really three things that they did in order to lay that world to rest and birth something new that I felt and I feel could be a very profound model for us in this moment where we desperately need to lay to rest a chapter of American history that persisted for a very long time and actually birth a new America. And the three things that they did were this: they grieved, they wept, they tore their clothes, they wailed, they told stories, they named names, they recorded every single detail of the world that was. They grieved the loss of it. 2, they told the truth about it. They engaged in the radical act of inviting a logic of truth-telling into a landscape of despair. And when they did that, they realized that it wasn't just the Romans who were responsible, but they themselves had been complicit in building a society in which such violence could actually take hold. They told the truth, including looking at themselves. And 3rd, they rebuilt. But they rebuilt not what was. They rebuilt a society that would be a counter testimony to what was. A society that was rooted in hatred, transformed into a society that was grounded in a foundation of love and justice. A society in which they were punctilious about the sacrifices that were offered, and they would even, I mean, people would die for offering sacrifices with an animal with a little bit of a stain on it or a bruise on it. Instead, we built a society that's first and foremost was designed in order to uplift the dignity of every human being. And I felt like this is a model for our society today, that we grieve the 400,000 plus deaths, that we say the names of every person whose life has been taken by law enforcement, that we talk and we speak actively and truthfully about what it means that this pandemic and that this kind of systemic racism was allowed to take hold in our society in the first place. And then we rebuild because we allow ourselves to be transformed, to believe that something better is possible, and together collectively build toward a different kind of future. That's the kind of social transformation that I'm talking about. And what happened on January 6th was just the latest unveiling, the latest laying bare of what we know has been growing. It's been seeded and nourished over the course of generations in this country. And that is a white supremacist, misogynistic, toxic nationalism that's built into the foundations. And if we don't clean it out, and if we don't rebuild in a very different way, it will continue to poison the water that we drink. And it will continue to hinder all of the growth that is possible in this country. And so this latest unveiling feels to me like just yet another opportunity for us to grieve, tell the truth, and then be transformed so that we can build a transformed society.
Wow, thank you. And I'm wondering, Reverend Cho, that makes me think about your book, Thou Shalt Not Be a Jerk, right? And you speak there, and I've seen sermons that, in talks that have been posted online as well, where you've spoken about how we've created a cultural Christianity that uses Christ, uses our religion to promote our nationalism and a theology that's then held captive by our politics instead of the other way around. And as Rabbi Sharon was speaking, I could hear the echoes of your sermons on this coming through, from the other side. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on how our faith can be used to tear down rather than uplift this cultural Christianity, and how we can build towards an interfaith and interracial reconciliation coming out of these places.
Yes, great questions. And this was one of those questions that I think we could probably spend a long time discussing and exegeting in some ways. I appreciate you just briefly highlighting my book. I've learned, this is a little comical, but I've learned that you have to be careful how you title your books, because the number one way that people search me online is Eugene Cho, overrated jerk, is how they find me. And it's a little awkward. But anyways, to your question, you mentioned the insurrection of January 6th. There are moments I still find myself not just grieving, but in tears over what I saw. Certainly what happened to our nation, but as a person of faith, to see symbols, to see words and phrases that are so sacred to many people of faith, to be used and to be abused and to be manipulated, to stand behind those things was incredibly painful. And I think it's a reminder about what Rabbi Sharon was talking about, that as we speak about building, we really need to spend significant time both lamenting, which is a spiritual practice. It's not just some politically correct thing to do. It is a spiritual, not just spiritual practice, it's a spiritual worship. I think our tendency, particularly in Western religion, and if I can be more specific, in Western Christianity, is that it's so often about me, myself, and I, so much about us wanting to get towards the glories of Resurrection Sunday that we don't spend time on what transpires on that Crucifixion Friday or that Silent Saturday. If I'm speaking more specifically about things like racial justice or racial reconciliation, I would suspect that the majority of this nation all love the idea of racial reconciliation. I know that there might be outliers or people that might deny it, but I think just in terms of the idea of racial reconciliation from a Christian perspective, I've not met Christians. Maybe they're out there, but I've not personally met any Christian that doesn't support the idea of racial reconciliation. But I think herein lies the tension and the truth telling that we have to be about. Everyone loves the idea of racial reconciliation until we realize that it involves confessing, confronting, truth telling, repenting, dismantling, forgiving, bridge building, and it's very overwhelming and it's hard work. It is really, really hard work. But the consequences, the opposite of that journey, is a continual spiral towards self-destruction. And so, yes, we need courage to have structural transformation, but also personal and interpersonal transformation as well. As you're asking more specifically about the issues of cultural Christianity, I want to just highlight two historical events, if I may. Just some food for thought. As I was preparing to write this book a couple of years ago, I began to do some research around what transpired in Nazi Germany. And I know that in today's world, there is a tendency for people to just jump quickly and just to mention Hitler or Nazism. But if I can just pause for a little bit and ask people to have an open mind. During the rise of Nazi Germany, of Hitler's regime, 93%, according to one historian, states that 93% of Germany were professing Christians. 93%. You hear story after story of young Germans, particularly young German men, that drank that Kool-Aid of ethnic superiority. 2 years ago, I led a small group of pastors from the United States to go to Rwanda to mark and to learn on the 25th year anniversary of the horrific Rwandan genocide. During that genocide, Historians also report that 91% of that nation were professing Christians. And yet, this horrific genocide, it began, which lasted for about 100 days, where about nearly or over 1 million human beings created in God's image were slaughtered. It began 4 or 5 days after the celebration of Resurrection Sunday in that nation. So I say this not to simply, dismiss and to insult these two respective nations, but to provide a warning to each and every single one of us. For those who might say the events of January 6th were just a small group of people that were just angry and feeling unheard, I think this is a time for us to again listen to what Rabbi Sharon was saying, that this is in our waters. It is all around our society, and there has to be a moral reckoning. And the good news about this moral reckoning, anytime from a Christian perspective, we hear the words repent. Some of us may have been conditioned that when we hear these words, we feel triggered or it feels like we're in trouble. It's an invitation to a better way. It's an invitation to liberation. It's an invitation to all that God would have for us. And so as I speak to those who might be listening, certainly of those who are of any faith or no faith, but particularly those who come from a Christian background, we can't look at what transpired in January 6th and events in Charlottesville and onward and ignore the complicity of cultural Christianity. We can't ignore that. So we need to have those conversations of self-introspection within our own families, around our dining tables, around our beds, around our feasts and celebrations. It is an invitation to repent, for God's kingdom is here.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Reverend Cho and Pastor Sharon, because I think what you've laid out, if I merge your comments together, those 3 steps, right? The grieving, repenting, lamenting, and then truth telling, as you said, Reverend Cho, taking accountability of where our Christianity, our faith practices in general may be complicit in where we are, and then coming together to build. I'm left thinking, and I'm so glad Dean Karen and others of our faculty, staff, students are here, because I'm left thinking, okay, as Pepperdine, as an institution, a law school, how can we foster an environment that allows our community to grow together through communal repentance, through communal truth telling, right? Through communal rebuilding? Can we envision, as a law school, a justice system that is dedicated in compassion to the needs of our neighbor? What would that look like? Oh my goodness, I'm fired up about that. And we could keep going, but I want to give the opportunity for questions. And so I'm going to allow to speak, just promote here, Amy Jika, who is president of the Interfaith Student Council and a fabulous leader in our community. And I know she has a question to pose, and then I've seen a couple of others in the chat and the Q&A, and I wish we had so much more time. I know people have classes that start around 2 o'clock, so that's the only reason why I'll cut off, I promise. But Amy, did you have a question to share?
I do, thank you. And thank you both for being here today. In fighting injustice and racism, I know that you both have learned a lot to work with other religions, and that's the histories that you follow. But I'm curious personally, for both of you, if you have learned habits or traditions or texts from a religion outside of your own that has influenced the work that you do.
That's a great question. I can start. I'll just tell you, I shared earlier about the influence of Dr. King's speaking on my own, the development of my own theology. I'll tell you, one of the most formative and important moments in my rabbinate was when I was a young rabbi, and we had just moved out here in my late 20s. And I befriended an extraordinary pastor named Ed Bacon, who was the rector at All Saints Church in Pasadena. So some of you might know him. And so Reverend Bacon invited me to come to Christmas Mass, which I honestly had never been to. And I just will say, growing up as a Jew, I wasn't religious when I was growing up, but I was scared of church because what I understood from my own history was that often pogroms started in churches with sermons that led people to leave on Sunday morning and go into Jewish neighborhoods and wreak havoc and bring violence. And so I was terrified walking into a church. I just had never in my life. And I went into his church because with love, he invited me, and he had his Jewish and Muslim friends sitting in the front row. And I was so just completely astonished by the pageantry and the beauty and the power of this gorgeous multiracial church in Pasadena. And he got up to give the sermon that Christmas Eve, and he told the story of Christmas in a way that completely blew my mind. And I know many people who are with us are, pastors and adherents of Christianity. Just forgive me, but I'll just share with you what he shared that night was that the story of Christmas was about a couple, Joseph and Mary, that were so poor and so cast out of the dominant society that she literally is in labor and giving birth, and nobody in that inn will give up their bed for her so that she can in dignity give birth. And instead, she's out on the lawn screaming in pain. And that all of Christianity from that moment forward was an attempt to rectify that wrong of treating the poor as if there's no room for them and holding on to our stuff and saying, like, there's no room for your kind here. I was so moved by this story. And I realized it wasn't my story. It was his story, but I also had a story. And my story was Yetziat Mitzrayim, the Exodus from Egypt, which I spoke about earlier. But I realized that what that story did for Ed Bacon, my story needed to do that for me too. That there was a theological impulse behind my instinct for justice, that there was a narrative basis for my presumption that the world was not as the world needed to be. And I left that Christian service, that Christmas Mass, a better Jew and a better rabbi. It didn't make me think that I wanted to convert to Christianity. It didn't make me confused about my theology. It actually clarified for me that what my work was in the world. And it also helped me realize, and this goes back to something that Dean Richards asked earlier, that in some ways, my real partners in the work are often progressive Christians and progressive Muslims and other people of faith, Sikhs and Buddhists, who also want to see a just and loving world. And we're all driven by our own stories, by our own core narratives. We speak about it in slightly different languages. We have different stories that get us there. We have different practices, different holidays that reinforce these values. But we are partners in this work, sometimes even more so than my Jewish siblings are my partners in this work, depending on what their theology or their approach might be. And for me, that was an absolutely transformative experience.
Amy, I'll quickly, or try to quickly answer that. There aren't any specific verses or texts or books that I would be able to cite right now. But I would say that the most informative practice for me has been building friendships and relationships. As a theological student who received my Master's of Divinity at Princeton Theological Seminary, while there were many positive things, I realized that the temptation is to just get full of hubris on theological knowledge and not necessarily grow in, again, relationships. I've learned over the years as an individual, but as a leader as well, that you cannot love your neighbor if you don't know your neighbors. And so I think this is an epidemic in our nation and all around the world. And as I'm thinking about the tragic events around the killing of Michael Brown in Ferguson, there were some sociological studies that were published around that time about the nature of relationships in America. And I know surveys are incomplete. They don't give us the full picture, but during these surveys, they did a 100 friends scenario of white Americans, Black and Brown Americans, and Asian Americans. And in a 100 friends scenario, the average white person had 91 white friends, one each of Black, one Latino, one Asian, one mixed race, 3 friends of unknown race. The average Black person, on the other hand, had 83 Black friends, 8 white friends, which again makes some sense because there's more white people in America, 2 Latino friends, 0 Asian friends, pause for dramatic effect, 0 Asian friends, 3 mixed race friends, 1 other race friend, 4 friends of unknown race. Asian Americans also tended to be among the most insular group of people. So again, I'm not trying to put all of my eggs in this basket. As we're talking about societal structural change, I actually think it is impossible to make significant progress on those things without a parallel commitment to interpersonal friendships. So over the last 10 years, it's been important for me to be able to build friendships with those who joyfully say, I'm Muslim or I'm Jewish, to be able to participate in Jewish friends' Shabbat celebrations, to be able to recognize the sacredness of the Ramadan for my Muslim neighbors as well. So that's been the most important piece of my personal education in the past 10 years.
Thank you. Thank you for that. And that reminder from both of you of how we can personally grow when we're open to being involved with the other people, the neighbor around us. There's a question in the chat that actually came from our university chaplain, Sarah Barden, who said that she recently heard on an NPR story that it's estimated that 1/5 of Americans are religiously unaffiliated, higher than any other time in recent US history. And those younger than 30s especially seem to be drifting from organized religion. 1/3 of young Americans say they don't belong to any religion. Do you think religious habits of injustice have contributed to this trend? And both of you are like, oh, do we jump on that? I'll remind you, recorded but not live streamed. So we'll edit and post, as my friends in production would say. But in all seriousness, any thoughts you may have?
Do you want to speak first, Reverend Cho, on this one?
No, please.
Absolutely. I absolutely believe if you are paying attention to the role that religion has played on the public stage, I can't understand why you wouldn't be alienated and marginalized by the concept of religion unless you're introduced to faith communities and faith leaders who actually live into what I suspect many of you would call the gospel and what I call our core foundational Jewish commitments. And unless we see that made manifest in the public space, of course people are fleeing religion. Because and this I mean, this is to I'm matching your not humble brag with my not humble brag, but this was the idea behind my TED Talk, which is when you look at the way that religion manifests itself publicly, what we see is religious extremism. We see people engaging in either acts of violence or serious regressive politics and policies, or you see religious escapism, which is this religion as a drug. Come here and you don't have to engage yourself with questions about poverty and equity and equality and inequalities. And you don't have to think about law enforcement and you don't have to think about the complications around medical treatment and who has access to medical care. Come here and let religion be your drug. Religion is either extremist or escapist, or the word I made up, routinist. It's like, come here and just be in a rhythm and don't think. Don't think. Leave your heart, leave your brain at the door when you walk in the door. Now, if we don't present a counter narrative to that public version of religion, which I believe is heretical religion, if we don't present a public alternative to it, then of course people are fleeing in droves because they don't want to identify with religious communities or religious practices or religious ideologies that either condone taking the lives of innocent people, perpetuating policies that cause tremendous harm, or that's already essentially dead. You walk in, a kind of monotonous spiritual engagement that's perfunctory and empty and meaningless. And that's why, honestly, like, when I get invited into mainstream spaces and when I'm asked to sometimes reflect on news programs after something's happened, I feel I have to do it, even if I'm busy and don't have time and because they have to hear different kinds of religious voices. And the other day at the National Inaugural Prayer Service, it happened. Did you catch what happened that morning? And who was invited to speak? And Bishop Barber is preaching the need for a third Reconstruction. And the president of the Navajo Nation is asked to speak. And we saw transgender chaplains speaking. And the two rabbis that were asked to speak, we were both named Sharon. We were both feminists, and we both put forward a kind of serious progressive agenda. And the reason that matters is because we have to complicate people's understanding of what it means to be a person of faith. It does not mean to align yourself with a white supremacist, misogynistic, wealth-drenched ideology or theology. It means to believe that we are all called to build a more just and loving society. It means that we're called to manifest God's own image in every single human being by working for and fighting for human dignity. So I absolutely blame the religious, not only the extremists, but also the mainstream religious leaders who haven't done enough to provide a counter narrative, a counter testimony to those voices of the extreme, for making a lot of young people and a lot of people in general flee religious life. And I feel hopeful because I believe that we can change that image just by stepping into the fray as people of faith who present a different way of being religious.
Thank you. Reverend Cho, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, just a couple additional thoughts to it. I mean, I think the answer is yes. There's probably a lot more nuance to that beyond just the statistic and number. And the nuances that I would love to just share is that oftentimes when people are talking about the religious nuns, people that are fleeing, oftentimes we're talking about the larger white religious community. You see many minority communities that are still growing within this nation. I think that needs to be factored in. And then as we're speaking about religion, I think it's also important to highlight that many religions, including Christianity, are growing in other places around the world. And I think part of it, again, is that there's more of a level of consistency from what we teach, what we sing, what we read, and how we live our life. The word that I think many people might be thinking about is the word hypocrisy. When there is an expression, an embodiment of hypocrisy, we have a dissonance. It's hard to connect the dots about what we're saying and singing, what we're doing for that hour or 2 hours on a Sunday. And no one is asking for perfection, right? No one is asking for a glamorized production of perfection in one's faith framework. But when there is a genuine desire in our imperfection to live out the teachings, from my perspective as a Christian, to follow after Christ. And this goes back to that comment about cultural Christianity. We can't just sprinkle on a couple words of Jesus and call that following Jesus. If we do that, we're simply, again, and this is kind of a brash way of saying it, we're actually pimping the name of Jesus to fulfill our agenda. So even again, as a Christian, if my faith has differences than other faith religions, I want to take seriously the person of Jesus, that he's not just a moral teacher, he's not just a revolutionary, he's not just a liberator, but from a Christian perspective, we profess him to be our Lord and Savior. He's our teacher, he's our rabbi, he's the one that we're called to follow. And if that's the case, and we take that truly to heart, then the way that we live will contradict many of the isms and injustices of our world and truly reflect more deeply the kingdom of God, the Beatitudes, the Sermon on the Mount, and the list goes on.
Thank you. And what a powerful moment to end on. I see questions, I see the chats, and I want to remind all of those attending that in ending this program, we're not ending this conversation. In ending this program, we're not ending the dialogue. We're not ending the journey of this school towards a place that is a beacon for lawyers, for thinkers, on how we can build what both Rabbi Brous, Reverend Cho have referenced, that more just society, that beautiful community where we come together, where we lift up and support and defend a justice system that is just for all people in all places. Please continue this. Continue it in your classes, continue it in your student organizations, continue it in faculty groups and roundtables, because it is only, as we've heard today, only in those conversations, in the relationship building, that we will move forward. Thank you again, Rabbi Brous. Thank you, Reverend Cho. Thank you to the Newt Institute for sponsoring this event and for helping us to have these conversations and move our dialogue forward. We are so grateful for all of you for joining us today. And I pray that you have a wonderful afternoon and rest of your weeks.
Thank you so much, Dean Richards. I just want to say, Pastor Cho said that he likes going to services, finding other communities where he can connect. And I invite you all to come to ICAR anytime. We're all online right now. So we stream live on Facebook Friday night and Shabbat morning. And if you're looking to find your way into community, you might even see some Pepperdine law professors and students there as well. But you're all totally welcome to join us anytime. And thank you so much. What an honor to be with all of you.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing. Have a wonderful day, all.
Thank you.